Good morning, it's Tuesday, May 19th, 2026, and you're listening to the Clovis Brief. I'm your host, and I'm coming to you from Northern Illinois, where we're looking at a pretty mild spring day ahead. Right now it's about 66 degrees, feeling like 64, with overcast skies and winds around 13 miles per hour. We've got a high today of 74 and a low of 55, with just a touch of light drizzle expected. We're talking about less than 1/100th of an inch of precipitation, so barely worth mentioning. Tomorrow, Wednesday, cools off a bit with a high of 60 and a low in the mid-40s, staying overcast. Thursday continues that cooling trend with a high of 59, then Friday brings some actual rain with about a 1/4 inch expected and temperatures in the mid-50s. The weekend looks to warm back up slightly into the low 60s with some more light precipitation on Saturday. So what do we have for you today? We're going to dig into some fascinating tech developments, including a major acquisition in the AI space that's got everyone talking, some wild technical achievements like a chess engine built entirely from regular expressions, and we'll look at why Simon Willison thinks you can catch up on the last 6 months of large language model development in just 5 minutes. On the security front, we have a pretty serious situation to discuss, one of our own, actually. A CISA administrator has been caught leaking AWS GovCloud keys on GitHub. We'll walk through that incident and what it means. We've also got multiple supply chain attacks to cover, including that mini Shihulad malware that's compromised over 300 NPM packages, a new Linux privilege escalation vulnerability with an exploit in the wild, and allegations about a backdoor in Microsoft's BitLocker. We'll also be diving into some cutting-edge AI research from Archive, covering everything from new attention mechanisms for large language models to fascinating work on embodied spatial intelligence. There's a lot to get through, so let's get started. Let's jump into the tech news, and we're starting with what might be the biggest story of the day. Anthropic reports that they've acquired Stainless, and this one's getting massive attention on Hacker News with over 450 points and more than 300 comments. Stainless, for those not familiar, is the company behind automated SDK generation tools. They've built a reputation for producing high-quality, type-safe client libraries automatically from API specifications. This acquisition makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Anthropic has been pushing hard on making Claude more accessible to developers, and having best-in-class tooling for API access fits right into that strategy. The implications here are interesting because it signals that the major AI labs aren't just competing on model capabilities anymore. They're competing on developer experience, on tooling, on the entire ecosystem around their models. I'll link to Anthropic's announcement in the show notes. Staying with the AI theme, over on Hacker News there's a piece by Simon Willison titled "The Last 6 Months in LLMs in 5 Minutes." That's garnered 463 points and over 300 comments. Simon's always been great at distilling complex developments in the AI space into digestible summaries, and this one's no exception. If you've been feeling overwhelmed trying to keep up with the breakneck pace of AI development, this is the kind of resource that helps you get your bearings. The fact that it's resonating so strongly with the Hacker News community tells you something. Even people who work in this space are struggling to maintain situational awareness with how fast things are moving. Now here's something that caught my eye from the more technical side of things. Nicholas Carlini has built what he's calling regex chess, and this is absolutely wild. It's a 2-ply Minimax chess engine built using 84,688 regular expressions. Yes, you heard that right, regular expressions. The Hacker News community is having a field day with this one, and rightfully so. This is one of those projects that makes you ask, but why? And the answer is simply because we can. It's a beautiful demonstration of what's technically possible, even when it's wildly impractical. The implementation is fascinating from a computer science perspective. Carlini has essentially encoded chess move generation and evaluation logic into pattern matching, which is both impressive and somewhat horrifying. This is the kind of technical tour de force that reminds us that constraints can drive creativity. Moving to something with more immediate practical implications, Cursor has announced Composer 2.5. This is getting 150 points on Hacker News with over 100 comments, so clearly developers are paying attention. Cursor, for those who haven't been following it, is an AI-powered code editor that's been gaining serious traction in the developer community. Composer is their feature for AI-assisted code generation and editing across multiple files. Version 2.5 appears to bring significant improvements to how the AI understands context across your codebase and makes more intelligent suggestions. The comments on Hacker News are a mix of people impressed by the capabilities and others raising concerns about becoming too dependent on AI assistance for coding. It's a debate we're going to be having for a long time. Here's a concerning security story from the developer tooling space. SafeDep is reporting that the mini Shihulud malware has struck again, this time compromising 314 NPM packages. This is getting 104 points on Hacker News, with 56 comments. For context, Shihulud is an info stealer that's been targeting the JavaScript ecosystem. What makes this campaign particularly concerning is the scale. 314 packages is a lot of potential exposure. The attack vector appears to involve compromised maintainer accounts or credentials, allowing attackers to push malicious updates to legitimate packages. This is exactly the kind of supply chain attack that keeps security teams up at night, because it's so hard to defend against. If you're running Node.js applications, you'll want to check your dependencies against the indicators of compromise that SafeDep has published. Now let's talk about something from the infrastructure and policy space. Ars Technica is reporting on a Mars spacecraft program that's got 2 senators asking questions and creating what they're calling a cloud of questions. The details here suggest there's some controversy around funding, timeline, or possibly mission parameters for an upcoming Mars mission. This kind of congressional scrutiny of space programs isn't unusual, but the timing is interesting given the renewed focus on Mars exploration we've been seeing. Space policy often involves tension between ambitious scientific goals and budget realities, and it sounds like we're seeing another instance of that playing out. From the operating systems world, there's interesting news about Haiku OS. OS News is reporting that Haiku now runs on Moan Max, and this is getting 58 points on Lobsters. Haiku, for those unfamiliar, is an open-source operating system that re-implements and continues the BOS legacy. BOS was beloved by many in the 90s for its clean design and excellent multimedia capabilities. Getting Haiku running on Apple Silicon is a significant technical achievement. Apple's Moan chips have a lot of hardware quirks and proprietary components that make porting operating systems challenging. This is great news for the Haiku community and for anyone interested in alternative operating systems. It's a reminder that even in an era dominated by Windows, macOS, and Linux, there's still room for diversity in operating system development. And here's a story that's generating significant discussion on Lobsters with 92 points. The blog post is titled "The Quiet Renovation at Bitwarden," and it's raising privacy concerns. Bitwarden has been the go-to recommendation for people looking for an open-source password manager, so any changes to their practices or policies naturally generate scrutiny from the privacy-conscious community. Without seeing the full details of what changes are being discussed, the fact that it's characterized as quiet suggests these may not have been prominently announced or communicated. Password managers are trust-critical infrastructure. They hold the keys to everything else, so transparency is absolutely essential. The community's response here shows that trust, once earned, requires constant maintenance. Now let's turn to our security briefing, and I'm afraid we're starting with something rather embarrassing for the cybersecurity community. Krebs on Security is reporting that a CISA administrator leaked AWS Gov Cloud keys on GitHub. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the organization responsible for helping secure federal networks, had an administrator accidentally expose credentials for AWS Gov Cloud, which is Amazon's cloud platform specifically designed for government use with compliance requirements for sensitive data. This is exactly the kind of mistake that security professionals constantly warn about, and having it happen at CISA of all places is particularly ironic. The exposure on GitHub is concerning because those repositories are indexed and actively scanned by automated tools looking for exactly this kind of credential leak. Brian Krebs doesn't pull punches in his reporting, and he shouldn't. This is a serious operational security failure that needs to be examined carefully to understand how it happened and ensure it doesn't happen again. Let's look at what's new on the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. The most recent addition is CVE 2026-42897, added on May 15th with a due date of May 29th for federal agencies to patch. This is a cross-site scripting vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange Server that occurs during web page generation in Outlook Web Access. Cross-site scripting vulnerabilities can allow attackers to inject malicious scripts into web pages viewed by other users, potentially leading to session hijacking or credential theft. Given that this is in Exchange and Outlook Web Access, which are ubiquitous in enterprise environments, this is definitely one to prioritize. Next, we have CVE 2026-2182, added May 14th with an extremely short due date of May 17th. That's already passed as of this recording. This is an authentication bypass vulnerability in Cisco Catalyst, SD-WAN controller and manager that allows an unauthenticated remote attacker to bypass authentication entirely. Authentication bypass vulnerabilities are about as serious as they get because they fundamentally break the security model. The short remediation timeline tells you CISA considers this an immediate threat. Going back to May 8th, we have CVE 2026-42208 in Berry AI Lite LLM. This is a SQL injection vulnerability that allows an attacker to read data from the proxy's database and potentially modify it. SQL injection remains one of the most common and dangerous vulnerability classes, despite decades of awareness about it. The due date for this one is May 11th. On May 7th, CISA added CVE 2026-6973, an improper input validation vulnerability in Ivanti Endpoint Manager Mobile. This allows a remotely authenticated user with administrative access to exploit the system. The due date is May 10th. Now here's a critical one from May 6th. CVE 2026-0300, an out-of-bounds write vulnerability in Palo Alto Networks PAN-OS. Specifically, this affects the user ID authentication portal, also known as the captive portal service. Out-of-bounds write vulnerabilities can allow attackers to corrupt memory and potentially achieve remote code execution. This due date is May 9th. Interestingly, Unit 42 has published a threat brief on this one, which we'll discuss more in our threat intelligence segment. The big one from May 1st is CVE 2026-31431, referred to as the Linux kernel vulnerability. This is an incorrect resource transfer between spheres vulnerability that could allow for privilege escalation. Bleeping Computer is reporting that there's now an exploit available for what they're calling Dirty Decrypt, a Linux root escalation flaw. When you see dirty in the name of a Linux vulnerability, it's usually referencing the Dirty Cow family of bugs, which were some of the most serious Linux kernel vulnerabilities discovered. This new Dirty Decrypt flaw appears to be in a similar vein. Unit 42 has also covered this, calling it the most severe Linux threat in years. They're referring to it as copy fail. The due date for federal remediation is May 15th, but given that exploit code is publicly available, any organization running Linux systems should be prioritizing this immediately. Bleeping Computer has several other significant stories. They're reporting that a new variant of the S-Hub macOS Infostealer is spoofing Apple security updates. This is a particularly insidious approach, because users are trained to install security updates promptly, so masquerading malware as a security update exploits good security hygiene. If you're on macOS, be extremely careful to verify that security updates are actually coming from Apple through the legitimate software update mechanism in System Preferences, not through pop-ups or downloaded installers. We already mentioned the NPM Shihulud campaign, but Bleeping Computer has additional coverage describing how leaked malware is fueling this new Infostealer campaign. The fact that the malware code has leaked means the barrier to entry for attackers is now much lower. Anyone can take that code and launch their own campaign without having to develop the malware from scratch. Grafana is saying that a stolen GitHub token allowed hackers to steal their codebase. This is another example of credential compromise leading to significant security incidents. GitHub tokens with broad permissions are essentially keys to the kingdom for software projects. Organizations need to implement proper rotation policies and scope tokens to the minimum necessary permissions. From Interpol, there's some good news. Operation Rams has resulted in the seizure of 53 malware and phishing servers. These international law enforcement operations are important for disrupting cybercriminal infrastructure, even though we know the adversaries will eventually rebuild. Still, these disruptions impose costs and complications on attackers. Now let's turn to some of the analysis from the security community. Bruce Schneier has written about a zero-day exploit against Windows BitLocker, and this ties into something we're seeing on Lobsters as well. A researcher is claiming that Microsoft secretly built a backdoor into BitLocker and has released zero-day exploits. This is getting 87 points on Lobsters and significant attention from Schneier. BitLocker is Microsoft's full-disk encryption solution, built into Windows, and it's widely deployed in enterprise environments. If there's actually a backdoor or a serious vulnerability being exploited, that's a massive issue. The use of the word backdoor is inflammatory and requires careful examination. Is this an intentional backdoor, or is it a vulnerability that has backdoor-like effects? That distinction matters enormously from a trust and policy perspective. Schneier's analysis will be worth reading carefully. The SANS Internet Storm Center has coverage of something called the Team PCP Supply Chain Campaign, with activity tracked through May 17th. Supply chain attacks continue to be one of the most effective attack vectors because they allow adversaries to compromise many targets by compromising a single trusted source. Moving to our Palo Alto Unit 42 threat intelligence segment, we've got several significant pieces of research to cover. First up is their threat brief on the exploitation of the PAN-OS captive portal 0-day for unauthenticated remote code execution. This is the CVE 2026-0300 that we mentioned in the CISA catalog. Unit 42's brief provides technical details on how this vulnerability is being exploited in the wild. The captive portal is commonly used in guest Wi-Fi scenarios and for network access control, so organizations using this feature are at particular risk. Unit 42 typically provides indicators of compromise and detection signatures in these briefs, which are valuable for security teams trying to determine if they've been targeted. Unit 42 has published updated research on the NPM threat landscape, with an update as of May 1st. This is their ongoing monitoring of supply chain attacks targeting the NPM ecosystem. Given the Shai-Hulud campaign we discussed earlier, this research is particularly timely. The NPM ecosystem is massive, millions of packages with complex dependency chains, which makes it both an attractive target and a challenging environment to secure. Unit 42's analysis typically includes statistics on attack trends, common attack patterns, and recommendations for mitigations. For any organization using JavaScript in their stack, this is essential reading. There's a detailed technical post on Active Directory Certificate Services exploitation, titled Inside ADCS Escalation, Unpacking Advanced Misuse Techniques and Tools. ADCS is Microsoft's public key infrastructure solution for Windows domains, and it's a surprisingly complex attack surface. Over the past few years, researchers have uncovered numerous ways that misconfigurations or design issues in ADCS can be exploited for privilege escalation and persistence. Unit 42's research appears to dive deep into the technical details of these attacks and the tools being used by threat actors. For any organization running Active Directory, which is most enterprises, understanding these attack vectors is critical because ADCS issues can allow attackers to generate valid certificates for any user, effectively giving them a golden ticket to your environment. The copy-fail research on CVE 2026-31431 provides Unit 42's perspective on what they're calling the most severe Linux threat in years. This is the dirty decrypt vulnerability we discussed earlier. The severity assessment from Unit 42 carries weight. They see a lot of threat activity, so when they call something the most severe Linux threat in years, that's significant. The vulnerability relates to incorrect resource transfer, which in the Linux kernel context often means problems with how the kernel handles memory or file operations across security boundaries. These types of bugs can allow unprivileged users to gain root access. Finally, there's research on Gremlin Stealer's evolved tactics, specifically how it's hiding in plain sight with resource files. Gremlin Stealer is an information-stealing malware family, and the evolution Unit 42 is documenting involves using Windows resource files as a hiding mechanism. Resource files are typically used to store things like icons, strings, and other data used by legitimate applications, so hiding malicious code in them is a way to evade detection. The hiding in plain sight aspect suggests this is effective at bypassing security tools that might not be examining resource files as carefully as executable code. The broader threat landscape context here is concerning. We're seeing simultaneous escalation in supply chain attacks across multiple ecosystems, NPM in JavaScript, PyPy in Python, and even language-agnostic attacks through GitHub and other source repositories. At the same time, we're seeing fundamental vulnerabilities in core infrastructure components like the Linux kernel and Windows BitLocker. The adversaries are operating on multiple fronts, from opportunistic mass compromise through supply chain attacks to targeted exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities in critical systems. For defenders, this requires a multi-layered approach: robust software composition analysis to catch supply chain compromises, aggressive patch management for known vulnerabilities, and defense-in-depth strategies that assume some level of compromise is inevitable. Now let's dive into artificial intelligence and machine learning research, starting with some fascinating papers from arXiv. First up is a paper titled Attention: Differentiable and Adaptive Sparse Hierarchical Attention. The archive ID is 260.5.18753. The researchers here are tackling one of the fundamental challenges in scaling large language models. Attention mechanisms are computationally expensive because they require comparing every token to every other token. Current hierarchical attention methods like NSA and INF-LLM version 2 try to address this by selecting the top k most relevant key-value blocks based on coarse attention scores. What's novel about dash attention is that it's both differentiable and adaptive. Being differentiable means it can be trained end-to-end with gradient descent rather than requiring separate optimization. Being adaptive means it can adjust its sparsity patterns based on the input rather than using fixed patterns. This is important because attention patterns vary significantly depending on what the model is doing. Some tasks require dense attention, while others can work with very sparse attention. If this approach proves effective at scale, it could significantly reduce the computational cost of running large language models without sacrificing quality. Next, we have a readiness-driven runtime for pipeline parallel training under runtime variability, archive 260.5.18750. Pipeline parallelism is crucial for training very large models because it allows you to split the model across multiple GPUs or machines, with each stage handling part of the forward and backward pass. The challenge is that modern workloads exhibit runtime variability. Some batches take longer to process than others due to variations in sequence length, numerical characteristics, or hardware performance. Traditional pipeline parallel implementations assume relatively uniform timing, which means variability causes pipeline bubbles where some stages are idle waiting for others. This paper proposes a readiness-driven approach that dynamically schedules work based on what's actually ready to process, rather than following a fixed schedule. This could improve GPU utilization and reduce training time, which translates directly to lower costs for training large models. Here's one with a provocative title: Code as Agent Harness, archive 260.5.18747. The abstract indicates this is about how recent large language models demonstrate strong capabilities in understanding and generating code, spanning from competitive programming to repository-level tasks. The Code as Agent Harness framing suggests they're exploring how code itself can serve as a framework or scaffold for agent behavior. This ties into an emerging area of research where instead of trying to make language models reason in natural language, we give them access to code execution environments and let them express reasoning through code. Code has advantages as a representation for reasoning. It's precise, executable, and we can verify its correctness. This paper likely explores how to effectively use code as the primary medium for agent decision-making and action. The paper on ESI Bench, Towards Embodied Spatial Intelligence that Closes the Perception Action Loop, archive 260.5.18746, is about spatial intelligence, which the researchers describe as unfolding through a perception action loop, where agents act to acquire observations and reason about how observations vary as a function of their actions. This is fundamental to robotics and embodied AI. Most current benchmarks for spatial reasoning test passive understanding. Can the model answer questions about spatial relationships in images or videos? But true spatial intelligence requires understanding how your actions affect what you perceive and vice versa. ESI Bench appears to be a benchmark designed to evaluate this closed-loop understanding. This is important because as we move toward deploying AI in robotics and physical environments, spatial intelligence that incorporates the perception action loop is essential. There's research on SURGE, approximation-free training free particle filter for diffusion surrogate, archive 260.5.18745. This is getting into the weeds of diffusion models, which are the foundation of systems like Stable Diffusion and DALLE. The paper discusses how diffusion-based generative models increasingly rely on inference time guidance, adding a drift term or reweighting mixture of experts to improve sample quality. Traditional approaches involve approximations that can degrade quality or are computationally expensive. SURGE proposes a particle filter approach that's both approximation-free and doesn't require additional training. Particle filters are a technique from Bayesian inference that maintains multiple hypotheses about the state and updates them based on observations. Applying this to diffusion model guidance is clever because it avoids some of the compromises inherent in other approaches. Finally, there's actionable world representation, archive 260.5.18743. The abstract mentions being inspired by emergent behaviors in large language models that generalized human intelligence, and the research community pursuing similar emergent capabilities in other domains. Actionable world representation is about building internal models of the world that aren't just descriptive, but are directly tied to action possibilities, what's sometimes called an affordance-based representation. This connects to the earlier spatial intelligence paper. The idea is that for an AI system to effectively operate in the world, its internal representation needs to encode not just what things are, but what actions are possible with them and what effects those actions would have. Taking a step back to look at broader AI industry developments, we mentioned earlier that Anthropic acquired Stainless, which is part of a larger trend of AI companies moving beyond just model development to building entire ecosystems. We're also seeing continued rapid iteration in coding assistants like Cursor, which reflects how AI-assisted programming is moving from experimental to mainstream. The technical research we're seeing on Archive shows that even as models get more capable, there's still tremendous room for optimization in areas like attention mechanisms and training efficiency. And the work on embodied intelligence and actionable world representations points to the next frontier beyond language, AI systems that can understand and operate in physical space. Welcome back to the Clovis Brief. Let's dive into home lab and infrastructure news. Starting with a major acquisition in the AI tooling space, Anthropic announced they're acquiring Stainless, the company behind SDK generation tools. Over on Hacker News, this story pulled 455 points and 314 comments. Stainless has been building automatic SDK generators that turn API specs into client libraries for multiple languages. For those of us running local AI infrastructure or building on top of Claude's API, this could mean tighter integration and better developer tooling down the road. The acquisition signals Anthropic is serious about developer experience, which matters if you're self-hosting agents or building custom AI workflows in your home lab. Speaking of AI development tools, Cursor announced Composer 2.5. This is their AI-powered coding assistant, and version 2.5 is getting attention for improved context handling and multi-file editing. 150 points on Hacker News with 107 comments. If you're managing infrastructure as code, whether that's Terraform for cloud resources, Ansible playbooks, or Docker Compose files, these AI coding assistants are becoming genuinely useful. I've been experimenting with similar tools for generating Kubernetes manifests, and the time savings are real. On the container front, GitHub Trending is showing continued activity around llama.cpp. This is the project that lets you run large language models locally with CPU inference, though GPU acceleration is supported. If you're running Proxmox or Unraid and want to spin up local LLM instances without cloud dependencies, llama.cpp remains the go-to. The project supports quantized models, which means you can run capable models on consumer hardware. I'm seeing more home lab enthusiasts setting up dedicated inference servers, often just a spare PC with a decent GPU, and serving models to their local network. For networking folks, there's an interesting post on Hacker News about when C++ compilers can devirtualize calls. 64 points, 40 comments. This might seem academic, but it matters for network automation tools and SDN controllers written in C++. Devirtualization is an optimization where the compiler resolves virtual function calls at compile time instead of runtime. If you're working with OpenSense plugins or custom network monitoring tools, understanding these performance characteristics helps when you're processing high packet rates. I want to highlight a project from GitHub Trending. Supertonic from Supertone-Inc. This caught my eye because it's related to audio processing infrastructure. While details are sparse, audio processing is increasingly relevant for home labs, whether you're running Frigate for AI-powered security cameras with audio detection or home assistant automations triggered by sound. The intersection of real-time audio processing and home automation is getting more sophisticated. On the Kubernetes side, PyTorch landscape is trending. This is a visualization of the PyTorch ecosystem, showing all the tools, libraries, and infrastructure around machine learning workloads. 46 points, 8 comments on Hacker News. If you're considering running ML workloads in your home lab, maybe for local image recognition, voice processing, or training custom models, this landscape gives you a map of what's available. Many of these tools run perfectly well in Docker containers on a Kubernetes cluster. You don't need a data center. A 3-node K3s cluster with GPU pass-through on one node gets you surprisingly far. For the home assistant crowd, I haven't seen major releases this week, but the integration ecosystem continues to expand. There's growing interest in local-first smart home setups, especially with concerns about cloud dependencies and privacy. Home Assistant with Zigbee or Z-Wave coordinators, running on dedicated hardware or in a VM on Proxmox, gives you a fully local smart home. No cloud, no subscriptions, no third-party tracking. The reliability is excellent once it's configured. One more infrastructure note, I'm seeing renewed interest in PXE and IPXE for network booting. This is old technology, but it's having a renaissance in home lab environments. Being able to boot installers, rescue systems, or even full operating systems over the network is incredibly useful when you're managing multiple machines. Combined with infrastructure as code tools, you can automate bare metal provisioning in your home lab, just like the cloud providers do in their data centers. It's overkill for most people, but if you enjoy that level of automation, it's deeply satisfying to get working. Let's look at what's happening in science and space. NASA has been busy. The astronomy picture of the day is available. I'll link that in the show notes so you can see today's cosmic view. The APOD remains one of my favorite daily rituals. It's been running since 1995, and it's a wonderful reminder to look up occasionally. From NASA's breaking news feed, we've got several interesting items. First, there's a story about farming in ancient Lake Agassiz. NASA's Earth Observatory posted this one. Lake Agassiz was a massive glacial lake that existed in North America during the last ice age. We're talking about a lake that covered parts of Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Minnesota. As the glaciers retreated, the lake drained, leaving behind incredibly fertile soil. NASA's using satellite imagery to study agricultural patterns in this region, and the images show how the ancient lakebed's geology still influences farming today. You can literally see the boundaries of the old lake from space, based on crop patterns and soil composition. It's a beautiful example of how geology shapes human activity thousands of years later. The Curiosity rover team posted an update covering sols 4893 through 4899. That's Martian days, sols instead of days. Curiosity has been drilling at a location called Campo Marte. What makes this update special is they mention a visit from the Psyche spacecraft. Now, Psyche isn't actually at Mars. It's on its way to study a metal-rich asteroid also called Psyche. But the team's coordinated observations as Psyche passed by Mars on its trajectory. This kind of multi-mission coordination is really cool. Different spacecraft sharing data, cross-checking instruments, using planetary flybys as calibration opportunities. It's efficient use of the assets we have scattered across the solar system. NASA also announced they've selected the next class of space health postdoctoral fellows. These are researchers studying how spaceflight affects human biology, everything from bone density loss and muscle atrophy to radiation exposure and immune system changes. As we plan longer missions, return to the Moon, eventually Mars, understanding these health effects becomes critical. You can't just strap someone in a capsule for a 3-year round trip to Mars without understanding what that does to the human body. This research has terrestrial applications too. Studying accelerated bone loss in space helps us understand osteoporosis on Earth. The MAVEN mission, that's Mars atmosphere and volatile evolution, made its first discovery of a specific atmospheric effect at Mars. I don't have the full details in the feed, but MAVEN has been orbiting Mars since 2014, studying how the planet lost its atmosphere. Mars used to have a thick atmosphere and liquid water on the surface. Now it's a thin, cold, dry atmosphere. Understanding what happened is key to understanding planetary habitability. MAVEN has shown that solar wind strips away the Martian atmosphere because Mars lacks a strong magnetic field to protect it. Each new discovery from MAVEN adds another piece to that puzzle. Switching to Ars Technica's coverage, there's concerning news about an Ebola outbreak. The World Health Organization has declared an emergency. The US has implemented travel restrictions, and at least one American has been infected. Over on BBC News, they're reporting a WHO doctor warns Ebola may be spreading faster than initially thought. This is serious. Ebola outbreaks require rapid response, contact tracing, isolation, treatment centers. The case fatality rate for Ebola can be extremely high without proper medical care. The fact that we're seeing travel restrictions this early suggests authorities are taking it seriously. From the CDC confirmation on NBC News, there's an American working in Congo who tested positive. Congo, specifically the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has dealt with multiple Ebola outbreaks. The healthcare infrastructure in conflict-affected regions makes containment challenging. On a lighter note, Ars Technica has a story about Australian Aboriginals caring for a dingo's grave for decades. This is about a 1,000-year-old burial that reveals close bonds between people and dingoes. It's a beautiful archaeology story that shows the deep, ancient relationships between humans and animals. Dingoes aren't quite domesticated dogs, but they're not fully wild either. This burial suggests that relationship goes back much further than we realized. Let's talk business, economy, and what's happening locally. The broader economic picture remains mixed. NBC News is reporting that we're about to find out if consumers are cracking under the weight of high prices. They're watching earnings reports from major retailers. Home Depot and Walmart are specifically mentioned. These retailers are economic bellwethers. If consumer spending is softening, we'll see it in their numbers first. Inflation has been persistent, even as the Federal Reserve has tried various interventions. Interest rates remain elevated compared to the ultra-low rates we saw a few years ago. Bloomberg Markets is reporting some interesting cross-currents. Goldman Sachs and Moelis are saying it's business as usual amid Iran conflict. We'll talk more about the geopolitical situation in a moment, but from a market's perspective, there's interesting dynamics at play. Tech-led stocks lower, according to one Bloomberg headline. The Iran deadlock is creating uncertainty, which markets hate. But at the same time, fund managers boosted stock allocations by a record in a Bank of America poll. So you've got this tension. Institutional investors are increasing equity exposure, even as there's geopolitical uncertainty. CT is saying 5.5% may be the next focus for the 30-year Treasury yield. That's significant. Treasury yields reflect expectations about inflation, economic growth, and Federal Reserve policy. A 30-year Treasury yield above 5.5% would be the highest in years. For those of us with mortgages, this matters. For tech companies that rely on cheap capital to fund growth, higher interest rates are a headwind. For savers, higher yields mean better returns on bonds and savings accounts. NPR has a concerning story about a steep drop in the number of people with Affordable Care Act health coverage. Their analysis found significant drops in enrollment. This could be due to policy changes, affordability issues, or changes in eligibility. Healthcare costs remain a major economic concern for American families. In the tech industry, we saw major news with Anthropic acquiring Stainless, which we covered earlier. That's a positive signal for AI investment continuing. The AI infrastructure build-out is one of the few areas where capital is still flowing freely. Companies are betting that AI will be transformative enough to justify the investment, even in a higher-rate environment. For local news in the Wonder Lake, Crystal Lake, Woodstock, and McHenry County area, I don't have specific updates in today's feed. It's worth checking local sources like the Northwest Herald for community events, town hall meetings, school board updates, and local business news. If you're in the area and have local news you think would be interesting to share, feel free to reach out. This podcast is based in Wonder Lake, and I always enjoy highlighting what's happening in our community. One thing I'll mention, as we move deeper into spring, this is the season for local festivals, farmers markets, and outdoor events. McHenry County has some beautiful forest preserves and recreation areas. Moraine Hills State Park near McHenry is fantastic for hiking and bird watching. Crystal Lake's downtown has been revitalized over the past several years with new restaurants and shops. If you're local and haven't explored the area recently, it's worth a weekend afternoon. That wraps up today's episode of the Clovis Brief. We covered a lot of ground, major security vulnerabilities with that BitLocker 0-day and the NPM supply chain attack, AI developments including Anthropic's acquisition of Stainless, home lab infrastructure trends, science updates from NASA including Curiosity's drilling on Mars and concerning Ebola outbreak news, and the economic picture as we watch consumer spending data. Tomorrow we'll be watching the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog for any new additions. There's also potential developments in the Iran situation that we'll track, and I'm keeping an eye on Pope Leo XIV's first encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, which is scheduled for publication on May 25th. That's getting significant attention on Hacker News, which is unusual for theological documents. It suggests there may be something technologically or ethically relevant in the content. As always, show notes with links to everything we discussed are available at the podcast website. If you have feedback, topic suggestions, or local news from the McHenry County area, you can reach me through the contact information in the show notes. Thanks for listening to the Clovis Brief. Stay curious, stay secure, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.